Okay, so it's nice to meet you all. My name's Shannon O'Grady. I am the head of product and the COO for Gnarly Nutrition. We've been around for about 7 or 8 years, and it's funny because I had someone today ask me like, "Oh, why are you choosing to get into trail running now?" And we've always been in trail running. Like I was always a runner. Eli's always been a runner. We just have been kind of a slow growth or organic growth company, and we haven't had a lot of resources to expand and to be able to form partnerships like we have with Ornery Mule Racing and to support races. And we're in a place now where we can. And so we're, I guess, taking a more bold step into trail running. And we've also got this release of this new product, Fuel 2.0, coming. It's on race courses now, but we'll have it to sell in May. And so I think it fills what we've had as a gap in our line before. We haven't really had a fuel-based product. Most of our products are pre-run or post-run. So I'll talk a little bit about that tonight, but it's really going to be in the context of full spectrum run nutrition. So everything about kind of pre-run, during run, and post-run. And then hopefully Trevor Fuchs, one of our pro ultra runners, will jump in and kind of share a little bit about what he does during his races. He's won the Hurt 100. He's won the Wasatch 100. He's an amazing athlete and a super nice guy. And I think has some really good information to share. I think oftentimes people enjoy listening to him more than me, spout about science. So hopefully you'll get something from the two of us, but hopefully he'll be able to join. And if not, maybe we can do this again sometime and get him to hop on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. See if technology works here. And jump right in here. Okay, so I didn't mention I am somewhat qualified to talk about this stuff. I have my doctorate in nutritional physiology from the University of Utah. As I mentioned, I'm also have been, although I don't do a ton of endurance sports, I'll always be a runner, but I've done Ironman, I've done a few 50-mile races. So I've also been in your shoes, unless you're, one of those crazy 100+ milers. Haven't done that yet, but I'm not counting it out. So I do have some background both in the sport and then in nutrition, of course. So just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to go over energy systems and fuel use. So people are often like, well, what does she mean by that? I really like people to understand the scientific basis of what I'm talking about and why we should choose the fuels we should. So I like to just dip my toes in the science so you really know where these recommendations come from. And then from there, we'll go into run nutrition. And as I mentioned, we'll talk about pre-run nutrition, during run nutrition, and post-run nutrition. And by the way, if you guys have questions for me, you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's both a chat box and a Q&A box. If you want to put all of your questions in the Q&A box, it just helps us kind of keep track of those questions, and I'll get to them at the end. But go ahead and enter them as I'm talking, so they're fresh in your mind. So this is, first I'm going to talk about energy systems and fuel use. And this is one of my favorite quotes, that running is an eating contest on the go. And I think it's very true because, obviously training comes into play and is a big part of success. But if you don't have your nutrition dialed, you'll learn quickly that it doesn't matter how much you train. You're not going to be able to use that training. A good friend of mine who is a pretty competitive runner always called 100-mile races catered walks in the hill. And I also thought that was a funny way to look at it. So first I'm going to talk about energy systems. So the main currency of energy in our bodies is something called ATP, which you may have heard of, which stands for adenosine triphosphate. So this is a pretty crude diagram of ATP and how it releases energy. So up at the top of that circle, you'll see a brown blob with 3 gold circles on the end. You can imagine that brown blob is adenosine, and it has 3 or phosphate groups attached to it. We can think of that ATP as a charged battery. All of those phosphate groups have a lot of energy in those bonds. And so we can add water to that molecule. And when we do so, it breaks off one of those phosphate groups. And when that phosphate group, that bond breaks, it releases energy. And that's how energy is generated in our bodies, one of the ways. You can also add it back in, and there we have our charged battery again. So you can see that it's a cycle where we're basically losing and gaining phosphate groups. And so there are a few ways our body, a few energy systems our body uses to generate ATP. One is called the creatine phosphagen system. I'm not really going to talk about that much today. You may have heard of creatine supplementation, which kind of feeds into this creatine phosphagen system and allows the body to generate energy really quickly in very dynamic actions. Another one is called anaerobic glycolysis. So anaerobic glycolysis occurs in the absence of oxygen. You can only use carbohydrates as a substrate or as a fuel to produce ATP and anaerobic glycolysis. So really high intensity exercise, when we go anaerobic, where you might feel a burn in your muscle, only carbohydrates are going to fuel that. Cannot use fat to fuel high intensity exercise. Anaerobic glycolysis also comes on when we're not able to take in enough oxygen to support our energy demands. That might occur, during the course of a race. So it definitely, anaerobic glycolysis becomes something we have to pay attention to, even in long distance runs. Aerobic glycolysis can use carbohydrates or fats, and this is primarily what you're going to see as fueling, ultras and most running, unless we're talking about sprints. So carbohydrates or fats can be used. Whether one is used or the other can depend on a few things, and we're going to talk about that in the next slides. So as we mentioned, running is primarily an aerobic activity. It doesn't mean that there isn't some anaerobic fueling going on, but most of the energy production that's occurring is occurring because of aerobic metabolism or aerobic glycolysis. So this graph kind of shows where exercise intensity and aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism kicks in. So on the x-axis, we have exercise intensity going from a low intensity to a high intensity. And on the y-axis, I'm going to move our head so I can see the graph. We have ATP needs. So at really high intensity, we have really high ATP needs. At lower intensity, when we're not exerting a lot of energy, we have lower ATP needs. And right in the middle, at about an exercise intensity of about 60%, you'll see the anaerobic threshold, which is our Vo2 max, which Loretta, did you have Vo2 max tested when you went to the lab?
I did today. Yep. All of this is sounding familiar.
Okay. It's like the worst test ever. Basically your Vo2 max is what I just talked about. It's when your energy needs exceed what can be satisfied aerobically. So pretty much you're not able to take in enough oxygen through ventilation to meet all of the energy needs your body has. You're going faster, you're exercising more intently. And so your body has to tap into anaerobic metabolism a little bit more to satisfy those energy needs. So remember, we talked about anaerobically, you can only use carbohydrates, but aerobically, let's see if it'll let me. Aerobically, you can use fats and carbs, and the lower intensity you go, the more your body's going to burn fat. Very rarely are you going to be burning exclusively fat. So I'm not talking about keto diets or anything during this talk. I'm talking about someone that's just eating a normal diet. So the lower intensity you go, fat will be your primary fuel, but as we gauge up that intensity, carbs start to kick in. And if we get past the anaerobic threshold at high intensities, your body's burning mostly carb. But pretty much all of the time, fats and carbs are at play. So, this is what I have on the left side of the screen. Very low intensities, fat serves as the primary fuel. Carbs become more important as intensity increases. So a lot of people ask, well, in that lower intensity, below 60%, what determines how much fat versus carb I use? Well, this can depend on a lot of things. I don't know if you guys have done long, slow distance training, so that really boring off-season, work that we're supposed to do at really low intensities. The whole reason you do that is because you're getting your body to be more cardiovascularly efficient at lower intensities. And so the more you run at those lower intensities, slowly you'll start to get faster and faster. And so if you can stay at a lower intensity and run faster and tap into more of those fat stores that you carry, then you don't have to take in as much food. And that's what people start calling fat adapted. So pro runners spend a lot of time running in their off season at low intensities for long distances. And by doing that, they're able to gain cardiovascular efficiency. They're able to get faster at these lower intensities, and they're able to use stored fat, as opposed to carbohydrates that they have to take in. And that's an important thing that we'll talk about in a minute too, is when I say that your body uses fat, it's not using fat that you're taking in as food, it's using fat you have on board. Even the leanest runner has plenty of fat stored in their muscles actually to use as energy. So just want to make that distinction. Other ways that you can work towards fat adaptation are, some people will do fasted runs at low intensities. That can help. Just be careful with that, because bonking is a very real thing. So you really do have to go pretty slow to make sure you are using more fat than carbohydrate. And then simply by increasing the proportion of fat in your diet, that can make your body to start to use more fat as fuel as well. Okay, so first we're going to talk a little bit about carbohydrates though, because that's the main energy source that most of us will need to take in while running. So glycogen is our body's storage form of carbohydrates, and our body stores enough glycogen to fuel about 60 to 90 minutes of exercise. So for runs in the 60 to 90 minute range, you might not have to take in extra food, because if you've eaten the caveat to this is, if you're running first thing in the morning and you haven't had a meal anytime soon, then that's probably not true. But if you're running in the middle of the day and you've eaten normally throughout the day, your body has enough stored glycogen that you wouldn't have to have a GU, or you wouldn't have to have fruit to fuel that. If you get over 90 minutes, that's when we start running out of glycogen stores, and to fuel our body to provide those carbohydrates, both for aerobic and anaerobic metabolism, we'd have to take in food. So glycogen is stored primarily in the liver, and the function of liver glycogen is really to maintain our blood glucose. We also have glycogen stored in our muscles, and the function of muscle glycogen is to supply energy during muscle contraction. So those are the pathways, the energy systems we just talked about. It's important when we talk about carbohydrates to talk about kind of the quality of carbohydrates and how our body processes them. So one way that's an easy distinction is to look at glycemic index. Glycemic index is basically the measurement of how quickly your body both absorbs a particular carbohydrate, and then how quickly that carbohydrate elevates your blood glucose. So this is a simplified graph showing glycemic index of a range of carbohydrate sources. So on the x-axis we have time, and on the y-axis we have blood glucose levels. And so there's a red, pretty sharp curve, and those are the high glycemic index foods, meaning that as you eat them, you see this immediate large response in blood glucose over a pretty short period of time. The green curve are lower glycemic index foods, and you can see that that response is a lower response and it's more drawn out. And so that's really the difference in processing. Doesn't mean that all high glycemic index foods are bad. No. One, I think we just need them for normalcy. Two, they play a really important role in sport. So particularly high glycemic index foods are important because they elevate blood sugar quickly, which we need when we're running. And they should be therefore timed around effort. So you might choose high glycemic index foods before and during running or exercise to keep your blood glucose elevated so that you have easily accessible energy, and then after to quickly replenish all that glycogen that you just used. So really important for those reasons. And then low glycemic index foods or complex carbs are of course important throughout the day. They provide our bodies with micronutrients and fiber, so vitamins and minerals and fiber, which are important for general health. And then having them included in your diet throughout the day slowly contributes to getting those glycogen stores where they need to be. So let's talk for a minute about fat as fuel, because as I mentioned, when I was talking about where we use fat versus carbohydrates at lower intensities, I was mainly talking about fat that we carry on board. So either from subcutaneous fat stores or fat stores under your skin, the ones everybody loves to hate, or from what are called intramuscular triglycerides, which are the fat that's stored in your muscle that your body can readily use in aerobic metabolism. Using fat as a fuel, like considering taking in fat as a fuel source while you're racing, could be considered. I'd say for ultra runs, potentially it's a good thing to do, but they're not as efficient way to get energy quickly as carbohydrates for a few reasons. So we already talked about even the leanest athlete has plenty of fat already on board, so you might not need to take in extra fat, right, to burn it. They're slower to digest than carbohydrates. So, if you're having a snack, having some fat in it is fine, but to get that immediate energy, you really need the carbohydrates as well, because fat is going to take a longer time to get released and break into energy that your body can use. They actually require more oxygen to make ATP. So per fatty acid, because fatty acids don't contain oxygen themselves, that's why they can't be used anaerobically. Your body has to use even more oxygen to turn them into energy. As we mentioned, they're not helpful at higher intensities, but they do play a role in longer efforts because they have double the amount of calories per gram as carbohydrates do. So at 9 calories per gram, it's a really efficient way to get in energy, but you should think of it more as a supporting factor and not as the primary thing that you're choosing. So make sure you get in enough carbohydrates and maybe consider fat for those longer races. Okay, so let's talk about pre-run nutrition. So what do I eat before my race and run? So I like to break this down into two different kind of like time categories. So ideally, your first meal for pre-run nutrition might be 2 to 3 hours before start time. It was funny because the last time I talked about this with Trevor, I was saying that like when I was racing more regularly, most races start at 6 a.m. if not beforehand, and I would not, if I fall asleep, I'm not going to get up at 3 a.m. to have a meal. And it's funny because Trevor actually does. So some people do. I am a horrible sleeper, and so if I actually do fall asleep, I would rather get the sleep than have this meal. But if you can, this is a great idea, because what you're essentially doing is you're restocking your glycogen in time for your race. And if you don't get this meal in, then you're starting the race potentially with glycogen stores not full because you've just gone through that overnight fast. So this isn't necessary. I'd say it's really an individual thing, but if you can get this meal in, it'll definitely be a benefit. And the whole goal is to restock glycogen and to also hydrate after the overnight fast. So it should be mostly carbohydrates and some protein. We don't want to have a lot of fat in this meal because, as we mentioned, fat slows down digestion, and we really want those carbohydrates to be able to replenish glycogen stores. Should be about 75 to 100 grams of carbs or 300 to 400 calories. Some of these can be from more complex carbs, but some of these should be from simple carbs as well. So in the example, in the picture, you know, there's some fruit in there, some bananas, some cereal. I think Trevor eats a bagel with a little bit of nut butter on it. So, you know, bagel being a good example of one of the simpler carbohydrates. But you don't want too much fat or fiber because as we said, we want those carbohydrates to be digested quickly. And then you want to try to get in some water and electrolytes so you're starting hydrated. Then pre-run nutrition. So even if you get that meal in 2 to 3 hours beforehand, you're still going to want to do this, and you're definitely going to want to do this if you're like me and you slept through that 2 to 3 hour pre-race breakfast. So the goal of this is to top off your blood glucose. So this meal is not going to have enough time to hit your glycogen stores, but it will elevate your blood glucose levels. And it should be 25 to 30 grams of simple carbohydrates, which is about 100 to 120 calories. Great examples are any kind of fruit, even fruit juice. You know, if you're a fan of like the gummies or the goos beforehand, you could do that. But something that your body's going to absorb quickly. And then water and electrolytes with this as well. You don't want a whole bunch of concentrated carbohydrates hitting your system without getting plenty of water in there too. And then potentially branched chain amino acids are a consideration here too. Branched chain amino acids are 3 of our 9 essential amino acids, so the amino acids that we have to get from food. And these amino acids are important because they kickstart muscle protein synthesis. And research shows that if you have them in your system while you're exercising, they can actually help with recovery after. So they prevent excessive muscle protein breakdown, which then helps with delayed onset muscle soreness, or that I really can't walk down the stairs, you know, the day after your race kind of feeling. So there's something you could try as well. And particularly if you're doing this after an overnight fast and you haven't had protein in a meal anytime recently, BCAAs could be a big help. So let's talk about now during run nutrition. So what do I eat while I'm running? I'm going to break this down into 2 different pieces: hydration guidelines and nutritional strategies. So let's jump into hydration first. So 2 different things to look at when we talk about hydration, both how much fluid you need to replace and then electrolytes. So we're going to talk about fluid first. A really easy way to get an idea, once, you know, Loretta and I earlier were talking about how a lot of these tests aren't super accurate, but they serve as a good baseline that we can then play with and fine tune through practice, you know, through our long runs and training. And so this would be a good example of that. How much you sweat can be affected by things like the effort level you're putting forth, the temperature of where you're running, the humidity of where you're running, what kind of clothing you can wear, the fluid status you had going into the run. So tons of different things. And obviously these things can vary from day to day and from place to place. So it might be important to do something like a sweat test more often than you think. Like as you get more fit, maybe if your race is in a different place than where you've done most of your training, like these are all things to take into consideration this season and whether or not the clothing you're wearing differs from when the clothing you're going to wear when you're going to race. But basically what a sweat test does is it measures fluid loss. So weigh yourself before you go for a run. You have to be naked because
Not running naked, but
yeah, not running naked. But when you weigh yourself, you have to be naked because you don't want the clothes and the sweat, how the clothes absorb the sweat to later on to affect that weight. So then put your clothes back on. I don't have that in here, but it's probably a necessary step. Then go on a run. Could be a run for an hour. I think that's the simplest way to do the calculation. So if you drank anything during that hour, note how many ounces of fluid you drink. You don't have to drink anything if you normally wouldn't. But if you do drink something, you have to know how much for this to be more accurate. Then when you get in, take your clothes off, weigh yourself again. And so then what you're going to do is you're going to subtract your post-run weight from your pre-run weight. and 1 pound is equal to 16 ounces of fluid. So we'll go through an example so you guys can see how to do this. But then you're going to add the ounces lost in sweat, which is that differential calculated in number 4, to the ounces that you consumed, if you consumed any, to get the approximate amount of fluid ounces per hour, because you did the test for an hour, that you should be drinking. So here's my example. If my pre-run weight is 130 pounds and I consumed 8 ounces while running, and my post-run weight is 129 pounds. So 130 minus 129 is 1 pound, and 1 pound is equivalent to 16 ounces of fluid. And then I said I drank 8 ounces while running. So if I add the 8 ounces to the 16, that's 24 ounces. So you should aim for about 80 to 90% of this number. And that's a good place to start. And once again, as you get more fit through your training, you might want to do this a few times and see how it changes. But as Loretta pointed out, always remember to put your clothes back on before you head out the door. Okay, so next part of hydration, what about electrolytes? So this is another thing, you know, that just is so individual and can change so much. But the amount of sodium in sweat, it averages about 500 milligrams of sodium per pound of sweat. So remember, we said a pound of sweat is about 16 ounces. But that can range from 220 to 1100 milligrams. So that's a huge range. One way to know if you're, you know, I'm a heavy sweater, and heavy sweater might mean a lot of fluid loss. But if you get those white marks on your hat or on your shirt when you're running, that also means that you're losing a lot of sodium in your sweat. And that might indicate that you need to take in more sodium, you know, in order to replace what's lost. So the factors that can affect sodium loss can be genetics, diet. The more salt you have in your diet, the more salt you're going to lose in your sweat. Temperature, humidity, and then acclimatization can also affect electrolytes. So a lot of racers that are training to race in a hot area will really work on heat training and acclimatizing to that heat. And that can actually reduce both the amount of sweat that they lose and also the amount of sodium in that sweat. But generally, you can start with about 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour. And you would get this through fluids and also potentially through the foods that you're choosing as you're replacing your carbohydrates. I think there are some companies now where you can send samples of your sweat and actually get the sodium content of your sweat measured, but not sure what their names are. I've just heard of that before. Okay, so really I wanted to talk now a little bit about some of our products that would help you do this. So Gnarly Hydrate, we usually give to races that are less than a marathon. This is because Gnarly Hydrate is really not meant to be a caloric source or a significant caloric contributor to your energy intake. It's really meant to hydrate you, hence the name, meant to replace what you lose when you sweat. So primarily water and electrolytes. So it has 250 milligrams of sodium per serving, which is about a 12 to 16 ounce, depending on how you dilute it, serving of hydrate. Also has magnesium, potassium, calcium, and chloride, other electrolytes that are important, but we lose much less of those electrolytes in our sweat than we lose of sodium. So sodium is really the one we want to pay the most attention to. Also has B vitamins, which are important for energy metabolism, and most athletes are actually low in. And then it has some sugar for effective hydration, but not enough to cause gut rot. So as I mentioned, it's not enough sugar to be a significant calorie source. So it's, I think, 30 calories per serving. But what that does is water is absorbed into our body both passively and actively. So passive diffusion of water into our bodies is based on a gradient of concentrates on one side in our gut versus in our blood. But active diffusion of water actually relies on a little bit of sugar. So having a little bit of sugar helps not just passively get water into our bodies, but also actively pushes water into our bodies. It's pretty easy to drink, and a lot of people just love it because it makes them want to drink more and hydrate more. So okay, so I'll talk about our next product in a minute. I'm going to talk a little bit about what nutrition might look for these longer races. And there's Trevor, so we'll make him tell us what he does in a minute. So for races that are 90 minutes or less, we already talked about this in terms of glycogen stores, but light fueling is a consideration. It may not be necessary. Really depends on what maybe your eating looked like beforehand, whether or not you were starting with low glycogen stores, starting fasted, or if you had had a good meal recently. Also might depend on intensity. The higher intensity you're going, the more likely you might need calories during that 90-minute or less run. At this point too, really use thirst as an indicator of how much fluids you should be taking in. At runs that are over 90 minutes, this is when getting on a plan, both in terms of hydration and in terms of nutrition, becomes important. So most studies show that there's a limit to the amount of calories that a body can take in, and that limit is usually around 400 calories. And when we try to take in even close to that or more than that when we're not used to it, it can quickly cause gut distress. So I usually recommend people who are just starting out, depending on how long the run is, start at 160 to 300 calories. So runners that are more fat adapted may fall at the lower end of that range. They might not need as many calories from simple carbohydrates. Runners that are either going for much longer distances or may be more of carb burners might need more of those calories. So it's something that you really have to play with. You know, I think starting around 200 calories, if you're not sure, is a good place to begin. So that equates to about 40 to 75 grams of simple carbs per hour. And then as we talked about, you want to aim for about 80 to 90% of your sweat rate results, and try to get in 300 to 500 milligrams of sodium per hour. So these are all things that are very individual that you'll have to play with. These are just recommendations to start with. You should, as you probably know, you should try to train the way you're going to race. And so you should be practicing all of these things on your long training runs and really dialing in both the proper amount of calories, the proper amount of electrolytes, and then the amount of water you want to take in. Oh, and my tip. So, you know, I think a lot of people recommend this now, but setting your watch timer for a regular interval of 15 to 20 minutes, even more often, is a great way to remind yourself to eat and drink. It's easy to enjoy the scenery or just get super into your race and forget. And once you're kind of behind on things like hydration and nutrition, it's pretty hard to dig yourself out of the hole. So try to be consistent and think of things that might help you with that in practice. Okay, there's Trevor. So I'm going to talk about Gnarly Fuel 2.0 now, which is our new product that I mentioned earlier, and the one that Loretta and Michelle was saying that they had tried. And Trevor can talk a little bit as well. Trevor's used it in a couple of his more recent races and FKTs. So Gnarly Fuel 2.0 is kind of the gap that was in our line. We didn't have a fuel source in our line. Hydrate doesn't have enough calories to really be a fuel source. So what Fuel 2.0 does is it brings in easy to digest carbs from glucose and sucrose at 25 grams per 12 ounces or 100 calories per 12 ounces. So 12 ounces is during the course of something like an ultra, you'll probably be taking in more than 12 ounces of fluid. So a lot of people will you know, look to take in 24 ounces, which would give you 200 calories, or I think in Trevor's case, he even makes it even more concentrated in order for him to get in more calories in less fluid ounces. But along with the 100 calories, you get 250 milligrams of sodium per 12 ounces. So once again, if you're taking in 24 ounces per hour for longer races, that'll get you up towards 500 milligrams of sodium. Similar to Hydrate, it has magnesium, potassium, calcium, and chloride. And kind of what distinguishes this product from a lot of other products on the market is we've included a metabolite called HMB. which is a metabolite of the branched chain amino acid leucine. So we talked earlier briefly about how branched chain amino acids can really, if you have them in your system while you're running, they can help kickstart recovery by minimizing muscle protein breakdown. And the direct benefit of that is you're less sore, you recover faster, and you can get back to training quickly. So by including HMB in Fuel 2.0, you're getting this constant kind of IV drip of this metabolite that will just continuously, help get you to a good place in terms of recovery once you're done. So it's really easy to drink. It's pretty light flavored. We're going to have 3 flavors we're releasing. 2 are decaffeinated. That's the limeade that's out on races now, and then the tropical flavor. And then we have a 3rd caffeinated flavor, which has 30 milligrams of caffeine from green tea leaf, and that's a cherry cola flavor. And I think Trevor's tried all 3. I know he's tried the limeade and the cherry cola, but he can tell you which is his favorite in a minute. So now I'm going to briefly cover post-run nutrition. So really with post-run nutrition, the goal here is to replenish glycogen stores, kickstart muscle repair and synthesis, which you've already done if you've been taking Fuel 2.0, and hydrate. Ideally, you want a ratio of protein to simple carbs of 1:3 to 1:4. So we want to get at least 15 to 20 grams of high quality protein in there. If you're eating plant-based protein, you might have to go a little higher than that just to make sure we're getting a good amount of the branched chain amino acid leucine in there. And then 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrates. You want to have this with 16 to 18 ounces of electrolytes. And, some of this can be hard to do if you're out on a long run. You could possibly plan ahead. This is where supplements come into hand. If you're not near your kitchen and can't make a meal, having a protein shake and a banana can really make sure you get this in. It's not necessarily important that you make sure it's in within the hour. I usually tell people as soon as possible. If you can get it in within 90 minutes, I think that's a great thing to shoot for. This is especially important for if you're doing 2-a-days or you're doing back-to-back long runs, to make sure your body's ready for the next effort and you're prepared to get the most out of that training run as possible. So that's pretty much all I have to say. I'm going to turn it over to Trevor now, and maybe he can tell you a little bit about what he does pre, during, and post run, and maybe tell you a little bit about Fuel 2.0.
Hi, Shannon. Hi, everyone.
Hi. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen, Trevor. So
okay.
So I can see you a little bit. I can figure out how to do it.
I think it's at the top.
Yeah, I've blocked it. There it is. Okay.
All right. Yeah. So let's see where to start. Pre-run nutrition for me is usually just making sure I'm pretty well hydrated. Depending on what sort of event or training I'm doing, it really varies. For races, I try to eat a few hours before a race usually. If it's an early race, I will get up at 2 or 3 in the morning and make that happen, and either go back to sleep or usually just kind of kick around and sip on coffee and hang out. And usually it's a pretty small meal. It's like a bagel with peanut butter or something like that on it, a little bit of honey.
I remember
usually yeah
like
usually like white bagel, blueberry bagel, something like that, something without a ton of fiber, just to make sure that I don't have GI issues later on in the day. A little bit of coffee. I try not to overdo it with the coffee too, because kind of dehydrates you a little bit, and also can cause GI distress as well. But I kind of need it to kind of get the juices flowing and get everything moving. And then just kind of sip water up until the race. If I have a little bit of time and I'm kicking around before a race, getting a little nervous, I might have a banana or something like that, just a little more right before the race to make sure I'm kind of topped off. During the run, it's funny. just this weekend, I did a 3-hour long run, and I don't know where everyone's at here, but in Utah, it jumped from like 30 degrees on Monday to 75 on Saturday, and my body was not ready for it at all. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I brought one 16-ounce bottle with Fuel 2.0 in it with about 150 calories, and I brought a few snacks and stuff. But the heat, I probably went into it a little dehydrated too. I don't know what I was thinking, but 2 hours into the run, and I stopped by a drinking fountain that I was almost positive was going to be on, and it wasn't on. I was completely out of water, and it was way hotter than I was expecting. I was just caked in salt, and I hit the wall so hard, and I was like walking up hills. My heart rate was like 180 walking up hills. And it just reminded me how important this stuff is. And I'm still kind of screwed up from it today. Even on my run today, my lungs are still kind of aching a little bit of burning sensation, just because how hard I had to push even just walking to get home because I was so dehydrated. So yeah, good reminder. Make sure you're staying hydrated. 16 ounces for 3.5 hours doesn't cut it, I'll tell you that, in 75-degree heat. But yeah, so on a normal day, I would certainly try for me 24 ounces of water per hour if I know it's going to be hot out, give or take. If it's cooler out, I can get away with 16 or so. And I usually shoot for around 200 to 300 calories an hour. I try to do most of that with liquid nutrition, like Fuel 2.0, for example, just because it works better with my body and I don't have to focus on trying to chew a lot of food and things. But for longer events, it's definitely a good idea to have sort of a backup plan, or just be able to throw whatever plan you have out the window a little bit and be able to snack on different things. I like to carry like leftover pancakes, or peanut butter filled pretzels are really good for me. I love those. A little bit of salt too. Stuff like that. I try to train with just all kinds of different foods. That way I know that come race day, I can kind of just wing it if I need to. And then I just kind of listen to my body. It's kind of like the same. Your body has a really good thirst indicator, which is a great way to hydrate for the shorter events, is just to go by thirst. I feel like your body also tells you exactly what you need to eat, if you're just sort of listening to your cravings. So if I go into an aid station and for 15 minutes I've been thinking about a pickle, that's that's what I'm going to eat as soon as I get into an aid station. So just because my body probably needs the salt and the acid and stuff. So just really focus on paying attention to what your body needs, and I think that works. As far as Fuel 2.0 specifically, I've had some really good experience with it. It's far and away the best fueling product that I've used personally. I've had major success the 2 times I've used it. So last year I did 4 events, I think. I did Hurt 100 in January, and I used Fuel 2.0 exclusively, except for about a 10-mile stretch because I accidentally threw my water bottle off a cliff and lost a few calories. So I had to use whatever they had at the aid station. But the rest of the race, I used it. And that's the best I've ever felt there after 3 years of going back to that event. I actually won it this year and felt amazing the entire time. Didn't have any lows. Was well hydrated, even though it was 85 degrees and 90% humidity the whole day. So worked out great. I wasn't able to use it in summer events, and I had some major fueling and hydration issues at both of those. Last year had some really unseasonably hot weather too, and it was really hard to stay hydrated, especially at elevation. And I kind of fell apart at both those events that I did. But then I had a chance to use it again when I went for the White Rim FKT down in Moab, and I was able to fuel pretty much exclusively with that all day because I had crew in front of me. So they were constantly handing me new bottles. So I just was able to sip on it all day. And again, never had any lows, finished in just under 16 hours and got the FKT and felt amazing pretty much the entire time. So really great stuff. As far as flavors go, the cherry cola is amazing. Like, I don't think I'd ever get sick of that. It's my favorite flavor ever. So The tropical is good too. I actually haven't tried the limeade, but I'm looking forward to trying it. So
Yeah, so Trevor was my guinea pig, for promoting it, like in terms of a number. We made him try flavors, tried a bunch of different carb sources on him, ratios of carbs. So
yeah,
yeah, I feel like this product is Trevor's as much as it is Gnarly. So we're super appreciative of our partnership with him. Yeah. So post-run nutrition, Trevor, what do you do?
yeah. A little bit depends on what I'm doing. If it's a long training run, I'll usually just try to get lunch in right after. If it's a race, I almost always pack a protein powder with me so I can fill up a bottle and have 20 grams of protein in a shake, and usually eat a banana with that too. So I'm also getting some carbs right away. Just because of races, you tend to kind of hang around the finish line and talk to people and stuff. And I think it's really important to get those calories in and let your body start recovering right away. And then I'll usually try to eat dinner or lunch or whatever time of day it is as soon as I can after that, after we leave. So and for races, usually I like to treat myself with pizza, beer, ice cream, things like that. Training days, I usually try to eat a little healthier, usually like leftovers I had from the night before or something, just so I can get it in quick. But yeah, I usually try to do around 20 grams of carbs, or sorry, 20 grams of protein and 40 to 60 grams of carbs, probably. That's what I aim for.
Awesome. Cool. So Trevor, do you have time to stick around for questions if anybody has them for the
Yeah,
next?
totally.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I think we have one question right now. So if you guys have questions for either myself or Trevor, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. So Nicholas is wondering, what if you take too many milligrams of sodium in an hour? How does your body react? More salty sweat? This is a great question, Nicholas. So actually, when you can take slightly too much and you can take way too much. So slightly too much, yeah, you might sweat out some more salt. Way too much can do the same thing as way too much sugar, which I don't know if you guys have consumed a concentrated sugar, overdone it on goose. It can land you in the porta potty. And both of these are caused by the same mechanism, and it's basically how water reacts to really concentrated things in your gut. So if you have really concentrated amount of sugar or a really concentrated amount of electrolytes in your gut, it changes the concentration gradient from your gut to your blood. And so instead of water going from your gut into your blood, water actually comes from your body into your gut, which causes basically diarrhea and is dehydrating. So it can definitely send you to the bathroom. I had, when I was doing a lot of triathlons, it was actually during an Ironman, a friend of mine that I had trained with was behind on his sodium intake, and thus he thought he had a bottle of those elite concentrated electrolytes in his like one of his aid station bags, and he thought it would be a good idea to like just shoot a stream of that. It wasn't like a couple drips. And so didn't just end him in the toilet. I mean, he was puking up, like his body reacted really poorly to that. So you can definitely overdo it on electrolytes for sure. But just taking a little too much sodium, it's just going to result in saltier sweat. Trevor, do you have any?
I was gonna say, I've had that experience with electrolytes taking too much, and I was just like dry heaving along my run.
Yeah, it can be pretty awful.
Yeah.
I'm definitely a very heavy salt sweater, so like I almost can't take too much if I'm being honest. I've never experienced taking too much. I'm definitely always on the too little trip.
Don't take shots of elite. I think
No,
that's
I'm
the
good.
brand of it's like, you add it to your water and like a few drops, you're getting 200 milligrams, and he literally just like,
oh man,
the whole thing. Yeah, he was in the med tent at the end of the race. But yeah, so Nicholas, that would be my answer. Any other questions from the crew, either for me or for Trevor, about what to do, race experience, what Trevor might do specifically?
I have a question, if you don't mind, since no one else is putting them in. What causes people to have their fingers and feet swell up at a race? Is it a lack of electrolytes, too many electrolytes? What causes that?
So I think a lot of times it can just be time on your feet, and that can lead to the swelling. Some people, I think, in combination with that, can start to retain water. There are some people who will gain weight after a race, and that can be if your electrolyte balance is off. But oftentimes, I mean, my fingers always get swollen when I go on long runs, and so there's definitely a class of that that's just due to, being out on your feet and having your hands, down or for longer periods of time. Let's see. Okay, something in chat. You mentioned branched chain amino acids. What natural foods contain them? Yeah, so branched chain amino acids, all amino acids are found in protein. So that's why, well, you can choose proteins that are high quality proteins, both that are plant-based and that are animal-based, that are high in branched chain amino acids. The problem is that when you're consuming them in protein, it takes a long time for the protein to break down into amino acids, and so you actually benefit from them. It takes, if you're consuming a whole protein, about 2 to 3 hours for you to break down that protein, metabolize those amino acids until you see a peak in your blood. And that's where getting something that's like a standalone amino acid supplement's a little bit different, because standalone branched chain amino acid supplements are absorbed and hit your blood in about 20 to 30 minutes. So significantly different, and there aren't really any natural sources that I know of standalone branched chain amino acids. I mean, there are things like Bragg's amino acids, and I've never really looked at what the branched chain amino acid content of that is. Trevor, do you have any idea of Bragg's or soy sauce?
Sorry, I was on mute. I don't. I've used it in cooking, but I don't know what the
I mean, they have both soy sauce and Bragg's are amino acids, but whether or not there's enough of the branched chain amino acids to have the impact that we're talking about, I'm doubting that. There are also like coconut aminos, but once again, like you need these three. Leucine in particular are the ones that really have this impact on muscle protein synthesis. But you can choose animal-based proteins, and high quality plant proteins like pea protein and soy protein are all really high in branched chain amino acids in terms of just incorporating them in your diet. So Anne is asking, I know everything is personal, but do you have any guidelines on combining gels and drinks? Thanks for the great info. Yeah, so my guideline for gels and drinks is really to make sure if you're taking in a gel, making sure that you're taking in enough just water with that gel. So as we just talked about in terms of the impact that too much electrolytes can have or too much sugar can have, think of a gel as a very concentrated sugar source. And so if you take that in and you just let it sit in your stomach, or you take that in and then you wash it down with something that has additional carbohydrates in it, you're then creating this very like carbohydrate concentrated environment in your gut relative to your body. And so it's more likely that potentially you're changing that gradient, and water might not be traveling into your body, but it would be traveling from your body into your gut, causing gut distress. So if you're going to consume gels, when you consume the gel, I would drink that with plain water, and then keep your calorie-based fluid like as something different. I hope that helps, Anne. Okay, Nicholas, sorry, I missed that one. Just to confirm, Gnarly Fuel 2.0 is going to be on the course for the Kettle 100.
Yes, it will.
Okay, if so, and this comes out in May, is there a way to get the product any earlier? I'm sorry, Nicholas. We're trying. So our products are NSF and NSF for Sport certified, and so NSF's certified products are third-party tested for label claim for contaminants like microbes, heavy metals, and pesticides. And then NSF for sport products are additionally tested for all of the substances on the WADA, or the World Anti-Doping Agency banned substances list. So all of the Fuel 2.0 flavors are both NSF and NSF for sport certified, and they're all in testing for that right now. And so we don't really have a ton of control to get it out to people sooner. We definitely would if we could. Ideally, we would have had it out, at the same time we were releasing it to races. So I apologize that that didn't happen. Trevor and Loretta and Michelle are all trying samples of the product that we're not selling to people. Let's see if I think that's all the questions now. Wait a minute or two and see if any more come in. Trevor, what's your next race?
Next one I really care about is Hard Rock 100. I have a shorter one, a 50 miler quad rock that I'm kind of using as a training run in May. So
where's that one?
That's in Fort Collins, Colorado. So kind of near where I grew up. So I'm just looking forward to hanging out with my dad and spending some time at home. So
and in your backyard.
Yeah.
And then Hard Rock, you had gotten in and it was canceled, right? 2 years ago, and then it was canceled last year. So this is like
yeah.
After it.
Yeah, it's happening this year for sure.
And it's been a pretty low snow year, you know, at least in Utah. I'm guessing Colorado's got to be somewhat similar. I know they just got some snow recently, but
yeah, but it hasn't been like nothing close to what it was the year it got canceled. And everyone's getting vaccines, and so hopefully we'll make it work. But
no significant river crossings.
No, well, no.
Maybe. Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions coming in, but
I do have one more question for Trevor, if you don't mind. Trevor, at what point do you start taking in the caffeinated Fuel 2.0? Do you have a certain point at that you do that, or go by feel?
I'm pretty well tolerant to caffeine, so I honestly, it's not something I've ever really focused on personally. I usually take caffeine, but it doesn't bother me if I don't. It's not something that I really focus on. I do notice later in races, if it's the middle of the night and I'm getting kind of sleepy, I will focus a little more on trying to make sure whatever I have is caffeinated. But I can start a race with caffeine and be just fine personally. So.
We do have a couple other questions that came in. The cherry cola sounds so good. Does caffeine have any guidelines? So it has 30 milligrams per 12-ounce serving, and so that would be about 60 milligrams. If you were taking in 24 ounces or 200 calories an hour, that would be about 60 milligrams an hour. Most of the research on caffeine, I mean, that's like maybe a small cup of coffee, I think. It really depends on how tolerant, as Trevor said, you are to it and how much you drink during the day. I think most of the research on caffeine, where the benefit comes in beyond just boosting energy, is it also reduces your rate of perceived exertion. So you don't feel like you're working, or you feel like you're not working as hard as you actually are. And those benefits actually occur at much higher levels, closer to 200 milligrams. So it would really be more of just like that energy boosting feeling throughout the run. And how you handled it would really be dependent upon how you handle caffeine and how much you consume in your daily life. But I would say, obviously we don't have it for you to train with yet, and I'm sorry. But when we do have it available, maybe I would use personally both the decaf and the caffeine, and maybe bring the caffeine flavor in, as Trevor suggested, later on in the race. Just so you're not getting, because if you're running, let's say 10 hours plus, that's a lot of caffeine in your system over those 10 hours. something to play with.
Mm.
Okay. Thanks so much, guys. This was super fun. And Trevor, thanks for popping on. I know that
Of course.
you know, we reached out late notice, so
No worries.
it's super helpful to hear your experiences. And I think often people get more excited about what you do and you know, how what's worked for you and what hasn't. And so I think it's great to get your input. So thank you.
Yeah, happy to help.
Really great to have you on. Thank you so much, Trevor and Shannon. Fantastic. Very interesting. Learned a lot. This is going to be a great resource for people to come back to and watch